Without further ado, Colonel Wagner.
I thank you for that warm welcome. I want you to know it warms the cockles of my heart. And if there's any damn thing I hate to do is to speak with cold cockles. We're going to talk about the B-25 today, and specifically about the strafer version of it, which really maximized its use. You all recall that Doolittle had the stripped-down 25s that they used off the carrier on the Tokyo raid. But the ones we flew out of the Pacific had been altered for jungle warfare. They found out that medium altitude bombardment just didn't cut it in the jungle areas in the Pacific. And how many of you know the name Paul Pappy Gunn? Oh, I'm glad some of you do. I got to tell you, Paul Pappy Gunn was an enlisted pilot in the Navy, did 20 years, and got out and went to work in Hawaii as a maintenance officer and also flew for one of the airlines over there. This is all before World War II. And then bought himself a couple of Cessnas, twin engines, took them to the Philippines and started PAL, Philippine Airlines, with those two airplanes. He was the guy who flew out a lot of VIPs out of Philippines when the Japanese attacked. He knew all the little runways and the jungles and so forth. He finally got down to the point where he had worn one airplane out. He was using it for parts for the other one. And it was time to get his own family out. He had a wife and 3 or 4 children in Manila. And when he went to get them out, they had already been, the Japanese already had them in the Bilibid prison. And they spent the rest of the war in Bilibid prison. He never was able to get his own family out until after the war. But the Army Air Corps recognized this guy was a jewel as far as knowing the Philippines, and his maintenance prowess was really something. So he was given a commission as a captain and sent to Australia, and General Kenny, who was the air commander on MacArthur's staff, recognized his abilities, put him to work. It was Pappy Gunn that took the nose off that B-25, and it started with 4 50s. He stuck in the nose, so with the 2 package guns on the side, he had 8 guns firing forward. He went out and he attached himself to one of the outfits and went out and proved that a low-level strafer, the B-25, was hell on wheels. So he said, why am I going to stop with 4? So he came back and put 8 in the nose. And by the time he got through with that B-25 had 18 50s on it. 12 firing forward by the pilot. 2 package, part of that was the 4 package guns. Upper turret with 2 out the waist, and 2 out the tail end. And no other bomber in World War II, including the B-29, had that many 50s. That particular airplane had the most. He went out and flew about 20 missions with that configuration, came back with all the film, and they asked the factory to turn them out that way. And out of Washington comes the naysayer saying, hey, the airplane won't even get off the ground that way. So he and General Kennedy, he was a major by then, flew to Hap Arnold's office in Washington, and they had a confab over the conference table with the engineers who said the airplane wouldn't fly. And before that thing was over with, General Kennedy was dumping strike photos on the table of what the airplane was capable of doing in that configuration. And the story is that Hap Arnold threw the engineers out and told them to get out and build the damn things. He was convinced. Anyway, we owe it to Pappy Gunn that the airplane got to be that way. In my own instance, I had was lucky enough coming out of flight training to be in the first advanced part. Primary, basic, and advanced was the 3 phases for pilot training. And in basic, they decided whether you were going to be multi-engine or single engine. I kept putting down fighter, 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 and I ended up with flying multi. The way they decided that was typically Army. There's a right way and the wrong way and the Army way. They just stripped us down to our skivvies and weighed us. If you weighed over 150 pounds, you went multi. It didn't make any difference whether you were 5'6" or 6'5". If you were under 150, you went out the fighter route. I think I weighed 158, so I was stuck. And we flew AT-10s, AT-11s, but the Army Air Force at that time decided that they wanted to see if they could take a combat aircraft for the advanced flight training, rather than graduating people on training aircraft and then going off to another phase in order to check out in a combat aircraft. So they developed what was known as a TB-25. There were 25s that were stripped because you didn't need armor plating and guns and all that kind of stuff if it was a checkout school. And I was fortunate enough to be in on that first class. And we washed a lot of guys out because that was a big step out of a twin-engine AT-11 or AT-10 into that B-25. That was big stuff to us. Anyway, it was good for me because they were signing me to B-26 training in Dodge City, Kansas. You know, the short wing, cigar-shaped, one a day in Tampa Bay. They called it the Baltimore Streetwalker because it had no visible means of support. And I wasn't too happy about going. And got out there in Kansas, and they found out that they had too many for the next class, and they were asking for volunteers to go to Columbia, South Carolina, and be reassigned. And I can tell you, I was the first one up on the audience. And I went back to Columbia, and when I got there, they said, how would you like to go to the first A-26 school? And I thought, boy, that'd be marvelous. That's as close to a fighter as it looks like I'm going to get. I'll fly the A-26. And then he quietly said to me, all graduates of the first class will end up as instructors there. I said, no, thank you. That's the last thing I want to do is have somebody else kill me. And so he said, well, you have a lot of B-25 time in advance. How about combat crew training in the B-25 at Greenville, South Carolina? And we can assign you there as a combat crew commander. You won't have to go up there and have to, that'll be preordained for you because of your time. And I picked up my crew and we went to California, Fairfield Susan, now Travis. And we waited about 7 or 8 days, and they finally flew a brand new one up from North American. And came up in the morning, we took a test flight in the afternoon, and then filed our clearance for the morning. Those of us who had quite a bit of time in the 25 would ferry those airplanes over. And those that didn't went over on transports, aerial transports. So anyway, we got off just before daybreak from Travis, and San Francisco was close to San Francisco. It was the departure point for you. You kind of overflew San Francisco on the way out. And one of my kids said to me, the crew, he said, "Sir, could we fly under the Golden Gate Bridge?" And before I could answer him, somebody else spoke and said, "Hell yeah, why not? What can they do to us? Send us to combat?" Which is where we're heading anyway. And we did fly under the Golden Gate Bridge on the way out. We went to Honolulu and island jumped, island to island, down to Biak, New Guinea, which was a big supply depot and overhaul depot for aircraft. They took the airplane away from me. I never saw it again. And they sent me up into a valley in New Guinea where they had a school. And what the whole idea behind that was, it was in NADSAB, was to get us acclimated to flying in the Pacific before they assigned us. And we were supposed to be there like 8 or 9 weeks. And I flew about 4 missions there on WWII and Rabaul, cleanup types of things. The Japanese were still there and we still had targets. And then all of a sudden the colonel called me and he says, get your crew together here, join in the 345th Bomb Group, known as the Air Apaches. And they just went in and attacked Loban in the Philippines. And he says, you're going to join them. And he said, and you'll get the rest of your training with them in combat. And he said, they've lost 9 airplanes in the last 8 days, so they need both crews and airplanes. B-25 picked us up, and we flew to Palau. And if any Marines in here, you know what Palau is all about. I think we lost about 5,000 Marines taking the Pellevo group. And we flew into there, and we noted that the enlisted Marines were in tents down along the swampy area there, and the officers were in Quonset huts. I made second lieutenants out of my 3 airmen. So we all slept in the Quonset that night en route. They never caught on to it. I passed them off as replacement navigators and pilots. And so they wouldn't have to spend a night in the jungle anymore if we had to. So I was then joined the 345th, and the organization that had lost the most airplanes was the 500th Bomb Squadron. When I got there, they said, you're being assigned to the bloody 500. And I said, what do you mean bloody 500? They said, well, they've had the biggest losses. And I said, fine. I said, and what is their record? And they said, well, they got the best record too. And I said, well, it goes hand in hand, doesn't it? Of the 4 squadrons, if they got the best combat record, they're going to have the greatest losses. And that was true. We were told when we arrived there to look at a guy on either side of us, because of you 3, only 2 of you are going to go home. One of you is not going to go home. And it turned out that way. We lost about 1/3 of our air crews. And the tough part about losing your air crews over there was that I can't tell you how many times we saw our guys ditch and get into the dinghies and never were seen again. Never seen again. And by the time the PBY's rescued aircraft got out there and everything else, they had disappeared. What happened to them, you can only guess. Maybe the Japanese picked them up, we don't know. We do know that just about everyone we lost in Japanese territory, when we were able to overrun that area, our crews were still by our airplanes, but they were headless. The Japanese soldier didn't care about getting you back to a prisoner of war camp. They just beheaded us, which made it very tough. I can remember the intelligence officer briefing us on the best ways to, he kept saying escape, escape, escape. And one of the kids said, how about if we get caught? He said, don't get caught, don't get caught. And that was just about it. I'll take you through some of the missions that we flew. The one on the right here, where you see the airplane, the one on the left, Tondaleo, this one, with the one prop dead, that is a real story. As far as we know, that's the most famous B-25 to come out of World War II. On a mission with 3 airplanes off of New Guinea, they were jumped by 40 Zeros. The 2 wingmen were shot down. 2 airplanes with them were shot down. This is Tondaleo. That was the name of the airplane. Right engine shot out. Pilot took it down on the top of the ocean. And we had radio altimeters in there, and we could get down to 10 feet. You could actually see the wave pattern on the altimeter. You could get them so low. The 40 Zeros were coming in, and we were going to have a heyday on them. And the top turret operator shot 4 of them down, and then the 5th one. He became an ace in the next hour. of a running battle, and then 4 more of those Japanese Zeros, couldn't have been too good a pilot, they got down, they were trying to get them. They got down on the ocean and ordered in. 4 of them went into the ocean trying to get to the B-25. So the airplane was given credit for 9 victories in an hour and 10-minute flight and made it home on a single engine. And so that's our famous Tondaleo. I'm going to give you a connection now. This is funny, I think. Tondaleo was the name of Hedy Lamarr in the movie Wild Cargo, which is the name of this airplane. And I thought that was a good connection with them. I don't know whether, I've never talked to the owner here as to whether he selected it because of that or not, but anyway, it is. Now, all of it was not combat mission, combat mission, combat mission. We had some funny times. We had a 12-holer outhouse that they had built with some siding on it, screening, roof on it, screen door. And what would normally happen on a regular schedule was a man was assigned to go up and pour inflammable liquid down into the holes, and then he would drop a match in there and burn off most of it, and then he would leave by sprinkling lye down in there. That was a standard procedure. Well, one day this kid got up there and he had his liquids down in there, but he forgot to bring a match, so he went back to his tent to get a match. And in the meanwhile, here comes this hairy, burly sergeant with a sawed-off pants, smoking a stogie and looking at an old newsletter about, Stars and Stripes about 6 months old. And he's got his boondocker shoes. You got the picture? And he goes in there and he sits on one hole and flicks the ashes down the other one. And we heard the damnedest boom you ever heard in your life. Looked out there and that outhouse looked like it was about a foot off the ground. He didn't even unlock the screen door. He came through it. It came right off hinges and all. He was out there pulling his pants up and running, still had the stogie in the corner of his mouth. And later he said he thought the Japanese had bombed the outhouse. That was one of them. Another thing is that we had an ingenious laundry machine. They built this barrel and they put paddles in there. And they mounted an old bicycle frame on there, and everybody took turns on riding that thing and turning the paddles. And you just threw your clothes in there. And then they had another barrel where you dipped them in and got the soap off and hung them up to dry. We had a scrounger in the organization, and every unit needs a scrounger. Somebody that can bring you the things you can't get through the normal channels. And this guy was tremendous. And when we were up into Luzon at San Marcelino, which is just above Subic Bay, we rented a villa in downtown Manila for people to take rest and recuperation when we come back from some pretty tough missions. Our boss would allow us to go down there for 3 or 4 days. But when you got there, you didn't have any wheels. This guy took care of that. And you talk about ingenuity. He said to me, he was an officer. As a matter of fact, he was one of the first guys I flew with. He was one of the pilots. And he said, take your rank off. He said, we're going to be privates this afternoon. And we went out to this MP area where they had a whole bunch of vehicles. If you left a vehicle in downtown Manila anywhere, even if it was chained to a light post, if the MPs could move that thing, you lost it. The whole idea was that if you didn't, the Filipinos would take it and it would end up and become a jitney after the war, for them. And so we got up there and he said, the first thing we need is a Jeep. He says, walk around we were out on the outside of the plane. He says, look for a Jeep that's got a lot of 3s in the number. And so I found one with 3 3s, and he said, hey, that's it. He pulls out a trip ticket and puts a number on there, a phony organization, scrawls a signature, And the two of us go in there and let a shaved-tail MP, second lieutenant, chew our rear ends out, a couple of privates, because we left that vehicle somewhere where it could be taken. And he turns it loose to us, and we drive out of there on our Jeep. As soon as we get out in the jungle somewhere, we stop. He pulls a little white bottle out of his pocket, and he makes all the 3s 8s. Okay? And then he makes up another trip ticket. Now we got a vehicle forever. He did that with when he found out, and I hope Admiral Kincaid isn't here, but he had a lumber yard in downtown Manila, and at that time we did a lousy job with as far as Manila Harbor is concerned. We sunk too many ships in the harbor, so we weren't able to get our own ships in up next to the docks to offload them. They had to go out there in ducks and load up and come back in. And we went down there. We got ourselves a 6x6 big truck, and we waited for one of those ducks to come out and had a load of 2x4s and plywood. Well, listen, a 4x8 sheet of plywood over there was worth diamonds, because you made floors of your tents with them. You put them up on ammo boxes and that sort of thing. And the 2x4s were made of like a framing, so you could run your tent out of the outboard of it, give you more room in there. Anyway, he says, "I'll be right back." He goes over, and there's a quartermaster truck driver on with this load of plywood. In a few minutes, he comes back. The duck takes off and goes into a jungle road, and we follow in behind him. And for a bottle of Aussie gin, we absconded with that load of lumber. And we drove it up to our base, but the kind of scrounger he was, he never kept anything that he scrounged on his own. It was turned over immediately to the organization to be used. He did the same thing. He's a good-looking guy, and he was dating a string of nurses in the 5th General Hospital in Manila, and particularly the supply nurse. And he came back up, and he called me on the phone in operations. He said, get an ambulance down here. He was on a flight line. And so we brought an ambulance, and he's in the cockpit. He said, "Back it up to the Bombay, back it up." This guy had 25-gallon cans of Coca-Cola elixir and 3 hindquarters of beef that the nurse was very nice who gave it to him. That went directly right into right into our mess hall. He was just a great scrounger, and as I say, every organization needed one. He really picked up the morale in a hurry there, because at that time we were receiving mutton from Australia in 5-gallon cans, and the mess sergeant wouldn't even open them. He just dug a hole and buried them. And we would we'd barter with the natives for bananas and chickens, but we wouldn't eat any mutton. Anyway, that was another one that I recall very well. Taking on some of these missions, when you arrived, even though you were a combat crew commander and had your own crew, you weren't allowed to fly them until you flew as a co-pilot for about 5 missions with the guys who had been there, so you could get yourself oriented on how you do it. At the end of 3, they turned me loose, but my little operations officer, who stood about that high, looked up at me. He said, "I'm turning you loose, but I got a word for you, advice." I said, "Well, what's that, Captain?" And he said, "If I catch your rear end above 50 feet over the target, I'll ground it." And he said, "You're going to have to find out that the lower you fly, the better chance you're going to have of going home." And he was absolutely right, because there were missions we flew, airfields, for example, we'd be down 10 to 50 feet off the deck, and we were watching ACAC blowing the tops off of trees, tracking us down the line. If we'd have been up at that altitude, they would have had us. We were called the China Sea Blockade. General MacArthur That was the name he had for this group, 345th Bomb Group. Because what was occurring was they were building convoys beginning in Hong Kong, coming out of all these Chinese ports, building a big convoy up to go to Singapore and that area to both refuel, add more troops, and more material down there. And when the intelligence people thought that that convoy had been built, we'd get the orders to go out and sink it. And you can see some of the pictures here in this book of, and we did a pretty good job of decimating those. So he called this his China Sea blockade, and the reward for that was when the secession auxiliaries came along, we were selected to go up to Japan, off of Japan, and escort the two white Japanese betties that had the Japanese officials in it to hammer, coming down to MacArthur's headquarters in Manila, to hammer out the surrender. And that's a funny one too, because we were told that we weren't supposed to get within 1,000 feet of those two Japanese betties. And so two of our guys were flying fairly close, and two more off the end. I had all the camera people on board of mine, both civilian and military, taking pictures like crazy. The navigator on the lead Japanese Betty was off 3 or 4 degrees, and you Navy pilots or you Navy people know 3 or 4 degrees in an ocean, you won't even see the island you're headed for. And so they tried to contact them on the radio, and they weren't getting any success. So the lead guy pulled up in front of him and made the correction. Well, the first thing he knew, the two Japanese betties started flying formation with him, and he starts worrying about getting court-martialed because he's not supposed to be within 1,000 feet of these people. Anyway, we got him to Ayashima. It's a little island off the northwest corner of Okinawa. We were there by that time. And one of them had a problem and couldn't leave on regular time. The other one, when it left coming back, we got on, I'm ahead of myself here, they got on the Bataan, which was MacArthur's C-54. And they were flown from Ayashima, Okinawa, down to Manila. And when they came back, one of them they had a problem with, and they couldn't get it started or something. And so the important ones got on the lead aircraft, and they never made it home. They had a problem and ran out of fuel, and we don't know how that happened. But they landed along the beach up there in Japan. Nobody got killed or anything else, but they had a way to shore on the return flight on that airplane. I had 2 missions I like to tell you about. One of them, because it was a fun mission, we had a requirement from General Swing, the commanding general, 11th Airborne, who had an airstrip and had his people down south of Manila. They were going to, they wanted to jump paratroopers in on a northern tip of the Philippines, because what had happened was the Japanese were all in the jungles and everything else, and they were working their way up north, hoping that their country would be able to get a ship in there and take them off. And so they were congregating on the north end. And he wanted to go up and look the jump area over and take his regimental commander, who was going to lead that one, and his intelligence officer and his director of operations with him. So, and he didn't want to do it in a C-47 because that's what they're going to jump out of. And he didn't want to tip them off as to what was coming. And he quite frankly wanted to make sure he had enough firepower. So he asked for a B-25, and I got to fly him. I went down and picked up his people. And we flew up there, and we overflew the area that they wanted to see for the drop area and satisfied that requirement. And then we saw a wisp of smoke coming out of some of the trees. And as I flew closer, you could see Japanese vehicles in there. And I said, I think I got an enclave of Japanese in there. He says, well, your gun's hot? And by this time, he had moved up and got my co-pilot out of the right seat. And he was sitting in the right seat. And he asked permission. He didn't force himself or anything. I go, wonderful gentleman. And I said, sure. He said, well, let's give him hell. So we went in and I strafed him about 4 passes. And we could see fires and everything else. We were hitting him pretty good. And on the next pass I made on it, he says, can I fire the guns? Like a little kid. He reaches over and, of course, the button's on the wheel. And he's firing 1250s forward and he's got a grin on his face you couldn't wipe off. And he had a ball. When we came back and we landed down there, he said, hey, I'd like to do that again. He said, you guys have more fun than we do. That was one mission that I remember. But I'll tell you, and this will be the final mission I'll talk about. I flew 43 over there and was holed 28 times. Had to put 125 down on its belly. But other than that, I was fortunate that I didn't get hurt myself. On one mission, we had a 20 millimeter shell go through the front windshield on co-pilot side. It went off with his flak helmet. We wore flak helmets. And when you get your teeth x-rayed, you wear that big heavy sucker. When we had one like that, it had armor plating in it. And I'll tell you, we were awful glad to get off the target and get all that weight off of us. This one came through and glanced off his head, knocked him out. He was gone out for about 40 minutes, as a matter of fact, and it knocked the top hatch out. And so when we took all that stuff off of her, what hair we had was standing on end. And but the wind coming through that thing was terrific. But we made it back to the Philippines all right. The mission I want to tell you about happened after the cessation of hostilities. We didn't know what they were going to do with our organization when the war ended. We had about 16 B-25s out, headed up into the Japanese Sea on a mission. And our radio operators got the word that the war, cessation of hostilities, and for us to abort the mission and return home. I don't think a pilot on there accepted that first. It was such a shock to hear that they challenged the message and made them resend it to us. So we knew what we were doing. And we returned home. We dumped our bomb loads. We brought home the ammo, but we dumped our bomb loads. We didn't know what was going to happen to the organization. Rumors were rampant. We'd already fired all of our 45s off and all the flare guns and everything else, celebrating. Drank whatever booze we had, little hungover. And I had a friend of mine who I knew when he was a young lieutenant and became an ace in P-40s in China. And he took over, his name was Johnny Allison, John R. Allison, retired as a 2-star general and just died at the age of 98 here a few months ago. And anyway, he was the director of operations for 5th Air Force. And I knew him from before getting into service. And went up to see him. I figured if anybody knew what was going to happen to him, he would. And he said, we were going to send you to Seoul, Korea, the whole group. And your commander would receive the sword of surrender from the Japanese troops in Seoul, Korea, and then hold the fort until we can get ground troops in. He said, but we looked at your records, because you guys had a fantastic record. And he said, you've been in combat steadily for 3 years. It's true. Went over in 42. And he said, we decided that a lot of your people have been here all 3 years. And that was true, most of the ground crew, of course. He said, so we're going to send you all home. We're going to disband the organization and send you home. And he said, how long have you been over here? I said, well, going on about a year. He said, would you object if I transferred you over here on my staff and helped me move to Japan? And I guarantee you I'll have you home by December, by Christmas, 45. I said, fine, I'd be glad to work for you. And it was in this role that I was with him. We already had some advanced intelligence parties up in Japan. And They weren't in radio contact, so a lot of the top secret stuff had to be hand carried. So they gave me some paperwork for intelligence crew and on the southern tip of Japan, and I think it was at Sugi. I don't know, I can't remember the name of the base. But I flew up there with a shortened crew, just 4 of us, and we turned over the paperwork, and in the meantime, 80 miles north of there was a prisoner of war encampment with Bataan Death March guys in it that were moved from the Philippines up there to dig coal. And they've been digging coal since the march. And it was unlike the European War. The Japanese didn't make any difference to them what your rank was. You dug coal. In Germany, they excused the officers from working unless they really wanted to. And anyway, their guards started disappearing, and it was after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and their guards were disappearing off their encampment, but they were afraid to go out because they didn't know whether it was a ruse of some kind, or they'd all get shot or what. So they picked straws, and the 3 winners or losers, depending on how you look at it, got out, scouted around. They were told not to don't contact any Japanese, just see what's going on and come back and tell us. Well, they saw a railroad going southbound, and so it was going along slow, so they jumped it. And it passed the airfield that my B-25 was on. And they saw the American markings, and we were walking around free and easy, so they decided to take a chance on coming. They jumped off the train and came in. And that was the first time that they knew that there was a cessation of hostilities. And this would have been maybe 22nd, 23rd of August. Cessation was the 14th. And the peace treaty in Japan wasn't signed until the 2nd of September on the Missouri. Anyway, they came in and they were ecstatic. Well, you've heard the story of 90-pound weaklings. These guys fit the bill. They were all skinny, clothes draped on them and torn and teeth rotting, and they had a terrible time. Anyway, they were happy that it was all over, and they said, is there any way we can get word to the rest of the guys up in the encampment? So I had taken on fuel there, so it was no problem. I had plenty of fuel to do it. I said, if you can pinpoint them on the map, we'll go up and drop them a note. And so we were able to locate where they were. It was in the sort of the foothills. There was no place to land or anything. So when we got up there, I flew over, and there's a Japanese flag in the encampment. And there's guys walking around, but you don't see any Japanese. And so I turned to my guys and I said, take your clothes off. I want your shirts and your pants and hats and fountain pens and whatever else you think these guys can use, and strip out the first aid kits out of the airplane, anything you can find in the airplane you think these guys could use, and put them in an ammo bag. We had an ammo bag, and I bombed the place. I opened a bomb bay and went over about 100 feet, slow flying, and dropped this thing out with a note in there telling them we had their 3 guys, that there was a cessation of hostilities, and to remain where they were, and that they will be the first ones repatriated. As soon as we can get some ground troops in, you're coming up, and in the meanwhile, stay where you are. Well, I'll tell you, the next pass, it was bedlam, because he was reading that to all these guys around there, and they were bananas, as you can imagine. And then I'll tell you, I cried like a baby, because they pulled that Japanese flag down. And up on that pole went the most ragged-looking, most beautiful American flag you ever laid eyes on. They had put that together from bits and pieces of cloth that they had got their fingers on during the 3 years and a half they were up there. If I could have landed that B-25, I would have. I made about 12 passes over there, and it was just a moment of my life I'll never forget. And on the way back, I started talking to him. You have no idea of what those guys went through. I know they did. Can you imagine taking cockroaches and crushing them into powder and taking them to the medical tent and sprinkling on the food of the guys that were in there to give them more protein? There's high protein in cockroaches. They had one pharmacist mate there, no doctor. They had a kid with a hot appendix about to burst, and this pharmacist mate had a little doctor's book, how he was able to keep it, but nobody knows. They took a knife and a fork out of the mess hall, mess tent. They sharpened the knife to open up, and he opened up that boy and took out his appendix, and they used the fork tines as a suture, run it through both sides, and then bent them over to hold the wound together. And then without a moment, he said, and we saved that fork in case we needed it again when he was all right. Pull that fork out of there. So they had hell on wheels up there. And then things got funny, because I'm flying them back to Okinawa, and I'm landing on Okinawa proper. And a radio in it, that way we have these three. And my pride is that I returned the first 3 Death March guys from Japan, returned them to Allied hands. When we flew over the port, Hayashima port, there was a portion of the 5th Fleet there. There were about 1,200 airplanes on the island, which was only about 2 miles wide by 7 miles long. We flew a lot of airplanes in and out of that one island. They thought that was our entire Air Force and our entire Navy. They couldn't believe that what they were looking at was just a segment of only one fleet. That was beyond their comprehension. Anyway, when I landed, here comes a whole entourage of cars, intelligence people from operations, and the ambulance with nurses. We had to sit in the damn airplane. We were in our skivvies. We couldn't get out. And they got out and drove off, and we're looking out the window waiting so we could get out of the airplane because we were in our skivvies. But that mission will stand out in my mind more than any that I know of. And I look at it as my most successful one. That other, I'm going to tell you about that one. The one on the right, that airplane is just ditched. And as it turned out, and I didn't know it then, the co-pilot on that airplane who had preceded me over there was a high school buddy of mine out of Stamford, Connecticut. I knew him well in high school, Bob Jensen. And the pilot was able to, when you get up, you will see that he's got one guy underneath the chin and he's pulling him over the dinghy. They lost the engineer. They couldn't find him in the airplane. He probably got knocked out or something, and they weren't able to get him out. This airplane was part of the flight. They were off of the Philippines, which was occupied by the Japanese, of course, and he flew for 3 hours and 15 minutes protecting that boatload of guys on the water until a PBY could get in and pick them up. And every time the Japanese sent a boat out there to pick up the crew, he'd drive them off with those 1250s. He sunk 4 or 5 of those boats because they finally gave up trying to get the crew. If they had gotten them, they would have died out there. And the funny part about it is that we just lost the pilot of that airplane here this past year. He was 94. He lived a long life. And Bob Jensen, who was the co-pilot on this one, about a month later was allowed to run his own crew. And show you how incidents are funny. He was flying on the wing of this guy who had protected him and kept him alive in January of '45. And they were on a mission. Bob Jensen was flying Rex Reese's aircraft, and they came over Hong Kong Harbor, and they were hitting shipping in there, and Rex dropped a bomb directly down the gullet of an ammo ship. And just as Bob Jensen is passing over it with his bomb bay doors open, it blew up into his aircraft and it knocked him out of the sky. And the airplane landed inland about 8 or 9 miles. The Chinese people, not wanting those, even though they were all dead, not wanting the Japanese to get those bodies because just for fun they'd hack them up, buried them in their cemetery. And it was not until 1948-49, when the American people came in there, that they were able to exhume them and send them home to be buried by their families. But and we lost Bob Jensen. But and today, I want to follow on one more on that same story. There's a British businessman in Hong Kong who discovered what was left of that B-25, and out of pocket has erected a monument on the site with the names of the crew on it. So that's a wonderful thing. And we now have, in the 500th Bomb Squadron Association, we now have his son, who was born 5 months after he went down. And it took us 2 years to find him because his mother had remarried and we didn't know what his name was. We finally tracked him down and found out that he, like his father, flew airplanes in the Air Force before he retired, and flew cargo aircraft. And to show you, and this is just an added addendum to it, when his father was incarcerated in Honolulu. What's the name of the cemetery? Punch Bowl, yeah. And his father, Bob Jensen, ended up there. When young Jensen and his wife went over to visit the grave, they arranged that when the day comes that they leave this world, they're going to be buried with him over there in the Punch Bowl. Good story. I'd like to open it up to some questions. I can go on and give you war stories, but I think you might have some questions.
For those of you who are new,
one other thing, that airplane makes you deaf. And so he's going to portray all of your questions to me because I won't hear them.
Were you ever based in Greenville, South Carolina, at Johnson or Greenville Air Force Base? Greenville, South Carolina.
Yeah. What about?
Were you ever based there?
Were you based in Greenville, South Carolina?
Pardon?
Ever? Were you ever based in Greenville, South Carolina?
I certainly was. That's where I took my combat crew training in B-25s.
You might have passed me.
Right outside, right outside the main gate, there used to be a tailor shop or something that was made into duplexes, 2 duplexes, and I lived in one of those, right outside the main gate.
Well, I became a little famous during that time because I took care of the papers and processed these men. I was 17 years old, only had 1 year of college when the war was thriving, and they came to me at 12:30 one night, and I had to process these papers, and the plane, the squadron, the whole squadron was going down to South America. And when I got through processing these papers, I had divided the squadron. One half of the squadron was to leave one day, and the second half was to leave the next day. Well, normally that's not the way you do it, but that's where I fit in. I said, oh yeah, they're not going all at the same time. And so that's the way they went. They got their gear, and half of the squadron went down to South Carolina, went down to South America one day, and the other half went the next day. The first group of squadrons that went down there never came back. And they went down in the ocean, and nobody ever knew what happened to them. They just completely disappeared. And if you know what happened to them, you tell me. Because the second day, the young man, one of the officers, came to me, and he said, I came to tell you something, and to thank you for my life. And I said, what did I do? And he said, well, that first group of young men went down, and we do not know what happened to them. And I did not go with the second half of the squadron, and you saved my life.
Oh,
Have you ever?
thank you for that story.
I want to know if anybody in this room that happened to be in that second squadron.
I want to tell, I have a gentleman in the audience here who flew with us in the Pacific in the same squadron with me, lives here in Virginia Beach. I'd like to introduce Vern Sawyer. Right here. Stand up, take a bow, Vern. He's younger than I am, but so is everybody.
That nice lady gave you an example. Just raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you, and then everybody knows what the question is.
How did you manage to transition from multi-engine to fighters?
Pardon?
How did you go from multi-engine to fighters?
Oh, yeah, that was, I always wanted fighters, said fighters, and never got them. As soon as I came back from Pacific, I wound my way into the 31st Fighter Group, was flying Mustangs. So they will fly the Mustang, followed by the F-84, F-86, the 100, and then went Mach 2 and the 104, so I had a pretty good career. In all, I flew 24 different airplanes in that period of time of 25 years in the service. But, and I have a good friend of mine who was a former chief of fighter test at Wright-Patt. Two of his pilots were Bob Hoover and Chuck Yeager, to give you an idea. He was the first one to fly the 262, German 262. He was known as Mr. F-86. He did all of phase 2 flying of the F-86 to approve it for the Air Force. And he told me, he said, he's flown 147 different airplanes. He flew all the Japanese fighters, German, Italian, you name it. He was here and spoke to you. But I said to him, you know, next to you, I said, I felt good with my 24 airplanes. And you guys, you're 147. And he said, let me tell you something. He said, my son just retired after 30 years in the Air Force. He was the first B-1 squadron commander and everything else. But including every airplane he flew in training, he flew a total of 7 airplanes in his whole 30-year career. He said, we were in the heyday, and it'll probably never happen again that we were able to fly that many airplanes. He said, he agreed with me though, when the first jets that we flew were so underpowered, you know, I envy somebody in an F-22 today, or in the 18. I really envy those kids. Okay.
So your East Coast training, I wouldn't mind Congress on that,
I'm sorry. I'll tell you what, I've got $6,000 worth of hearing aids. Anybody want them? They don't work. They don't work with the dam.
He wanted to know what training squadrons you were in.
Training squadrons?
The numbers, yes, sir.
I can tell you, the training squadrons I were in, I flew Stearman's in.
Class.
Pardon?
Which class? Which class?
Oh, Class 44G. Mine was a strange career. I was in uniform 14 months before Pearl Harbor. I enlisted as a private, all the time wanting to fly, and By the time Pearl Harbor was over and a couple more months, I didn't have college, so I was taking courses where I could in order to be qualified for the 2 years to go to pilot as a cadet. And all of a sudden, they came out with a new order of things and said that those who were on active duty, who could qualify physically and wanted to go to pilot training, if they didn't have the 2 years, could take an equivalency exam. So I was waiting for the announcement of when the next one would be on, and I looked up on a board one day. I was a three-striper, I was a sergeant, and I looked up on the board and it said tests for warrant officer, and I figured, gee, I'll take that. I've never taken an exam, military exam like that. I'll take that just to see what they're like. Damned if I didn't pass it. And they made me a warrant officer. And then before I turned 21, I was a chief warrant officer. And now I didn't need the 2 years of college because an officer could ask for pilot training and grade and go, and that's exactly what happened to me. And everything was fortunate from there on in, because my commanding officer was William B. Garrison, who was one of the founding founders of USAA, and had a lot to do with Geico getting started. As a matter of fact, he was an old cavalry officer turned pilot, and had retired, and they brought him back in World War II, and he was my commander, and he still had a home in Washington. And when I told him that I wanted to go to pilot training, I was on his staff, he said, you have your application here this afternoon, I'm going back home this weekend, and I'll walk that through the Pentagon building for you. Well, what did that do for me? Instead of a 6-month wait to be picked up to go to a class, I was gone in 6 weeks, not 6 months. I was in a class in 6 weeks. That's how I finally got into the pilot training, and I went through as a chief warrant officer. Yeah.
Wish we had 2 of these.
Do you remember the name of your scrounger?
I'm sorry. Repeat it to me.
The scrounger, do you remember the scrounger's name?
Pardon?
The gentleman who was the scrounger?
Oh, yeah, I remember him. I've never released his name, though. I don't want to get this guy into trouble. I think he's a bank president now in Minnesota. That's a good follow-on job. And then for a scrounger,